In early 1942, the Pacific Ocean seemed to belong to Japan. Pearl Harbor was still burning in American memory. Battleships lay crippled in shallow water, and the myth of Japanese naval invincibility felt terrifyingly real. Across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese forces advanced with speed and confidence, and at sea, their carrier fleet appeared unstoppable. In just a few months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had sunk or neutralized 4 American aircraft carriers. To Japanese planners, this was proof that America could be knocked out before it ever recovered. But what Japan saw in 1942 was only the surface of a much larger storm. Because while Japan counted victories, America was counting something else entirely: factories, shipyards, steel, engines, and time. To understand why Japan believed sinking 4 U.S. carriers would decide the war, we need to go back to how naval power was understood before World War II. For decades, battleships had ruled the seas. Carriers were important, but many admirals still saw them as support ships rather than the core of naval warfare. Japan, however, embraced carriers earlier than most. By the late 1930s, Japan possessed one of the most experienced naval aviation forces in the world. Japanese pilots trained longer. Carrier operations were drilled relentlessly. Their aircraft were light, long-ranged, and deadly. In contrast, America entered the war with fewer carriers in the Pacific and a fleet still divided between the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it was not meant to destroy America forever. It was meant to shock the United States into negotiation. Japanese leaders believed that if they could cripple U.S. naval power quickly, America, seen as industrial but weak-willed, would choose compromise over a long war. Then came 1942. In rapid succession, U.S. carriers were lost or damaged. The Lexington went down in the Coral Sea. Yorktown was lost at Midway. Wasp would follow later that year. For Japanese commanders, these losses seemed catastrophic for America. For carriers removed from the battlefield, to Japanese naval officers, each carrier represented years of construction and training. In their own shipyards, a fleet carrier could take many years to design, lay down, and complete. Losing one was painful. Losing several could be fatal. So when Japan counted American losses, they assumed America was bleeding the same way Japan would. They were wrong. Because while Japanese admirals looked at the ocean, American planners were looking inland, at Detroit, at California, at shipyards along both coasts that were already transforming. Even before Pearl Harbor, American naval planners had anticipated war. Quietly, contracts were signed, designs finalized, steel orders placed. One class of ships would soon define the naval war in the Pacific: the Essex-class aircraft carrier. The Essex was not a desperate wartime improvisation. It was the result of years of planning, refined after lessons from early carriers like the Yorktown class. Larger, tougher, with greater aircraft capacity, better armor, and improved damage control, the Essex was designed not just to fight, but to survive. And most importantly, it was designed to be built fast. While Japanese shipyards focused on craftsmanship and limited production capacity, American industry focused on repetition and scale. Shipyards were reorganized for efficiency. Components were standardized. Entire sections of carriers were built separately and then assembled like massive steel puzzles. In 1942, while Japanese newspapers celebrated carrier sinkings, American shipyards were laying down keels, one after another. The first Essex-class carriers were already under construction when the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. More were authorized immediately after. Production schedules were not slowed by losses. They accelerated because of them. To Japan, sinking a carrier was a strategic victory. To America, losing a carrier became motivation to build 3 more. This difference in thinking would decide the war. At Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 carriers in a single battle. It was a shock that shattered the core of Japan's naval air power. Experienced pilots were lost, aircraft destroyed, and momentum reversed. But even then, Japanese leaders believed America had suffered just as badly. They did not yet realize that America's losses were already being replaced on paper, in steel, and on assembly lines. By the end of 1942, new Essex-class carriers were launching. By 1943, they were entering combat. By 1944, they were arriving in waves. Each Essex carrier carried more aircraft than earlier U.S. carriers. Each had better radar, stronger anti-aircraft defenses, and crews trained with lessons learned from earlier battles. They did not operate alone. They operated in task forces, protected by destroyers, cruisers, and logistics ships that kept them supplied indefinitely. Japan had built brilliant weapons. America built a system, and systems win wars. What began in 1942 as Japanese dominance slowly transformed into something Japanese commanders could no longer control. Every carrier sunk by Japan was replaced not one for one, but many for one. By war's end, the United States would commission 14 Essex-class fleet carriers, each more capable than the ships Japan had destroyed. This was not luck. It was industrial warfare on a scale the world had never seen, and Japan was about to face the consequences. By the summer of 1942, the war at sea had stripped away every illusion the United States Navy still held. 4 fleet carriers lay on the ocean floor, their steel frames twisted and silent beneath the Pacific. Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, and Wasp were no longer names painted on hulls, but lessons written in blood and fire. For Japan, these victories seemed to confirm what their admirals had believed all along, that the American Navy was fragile, slow to recover, and dependent on a handful of expensive ships. But in Washington, the reaction was not despair. It was calculation. Even before the smoke cleared at Midway, American planners were already asking a different question. Not how to replace lost carriers, but how to ensure the enemy could never destroy enough of them again. The answer would not be found in a single ship or even a single class. It would be found in scale. The United States did not seek to match Japan carrier for carrier. It sought to overwhelm Japan with numbers so large that loss itself became irrelevant. This mindset was born not in desperation, but in industrial confidence. America understood something Japan could not afford to admit. Wars in the modern age were won not only by bravery or tactics, but by factories that never slept. As early as 1941, naval architects had been quietly refining a carrier design that would eclipse everything before it. Larger than the Yorktown class, tougher than the Lexingtons, and engineered for mass production rather than handcrafted perfection, this design would soon be known as the Essex-class. When war arrived, the blueprints were already waiting. What followed Midway was not panic construction, but controlled acceleration. Shipyards along both coasts were expanded, retooled, and synchronized. Slipways were lengthened. Labor shifts doubled. Welding replaced rivets. Subassemblies were built miles away, transported by rail, and lowered into place with industrial precision. Where Japan saw carriers as national treasures, America treated them as repeatable machines. Each Essex-class carrier was designed to carry more aircraft, absorb more punishment, and return to battle faster than anything Japan could field. Their flight decks were broader, their hangars more flexible. Their damage control systems were lessons learned from burning decks and flooding compartments. Every weakness exposed in 1942 was addressed not with theory, but with steel. While Japanese dockyards struggled to repair damaged carriers with limited materials and exhausted crews, American yards were laying keels at a pace that stunned even Allied observers. A carrier that once took years to plan and build could now be launched in months. The United States was not merely replacing losses. It was building a fleet that assumed losses would happen and planned to outproduce them anyway. Japanese intelligence officers began reporting numbers that seemed impossible. Hull numbers kept appearing in reconnaissance photos. New carriers arrived before old ones had even been fully cataloged. At first, Tokyo dismissed these reports as exaggeration. But soon, the truth became impossible to ignore. The balance of naval power was shifting, not gradually, but violently. Japan had won battles in 1942. America was preparing to win the war. And as the first Essex-class hulls slid into the water, silent and unfinished, they carried with them a promise that no single victory, no matter how dramatic, could ever again decide the fate of the Pacific. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War had entered a dangerous transition phase. Japan still appeared dominant on maps, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The loss of 4 American carriers earlier that year had not broken the United States. It had awakened it. American shipyards were no longer thinking in terms of replacement. They were thinking in terms of overwhelming multiplication. Japanese naval planners continued to believe that aircraft carriers were rare, irreplaceable assets. Their entire doctrine assumed that once an enemy carrier was sunk, it would take years to recover. This assumption was logical by pre-war standards. What Japan did not yet understand was that America had quietly abandoned those standards altogether. Across the United States, shipyards were operating around the clock. New construction methods, modular assembly, and standardized designs meant that carriers were no longer handcrafted warships. They were becoming industrial products. Hull sections were built simultaneously in different locations, then welded together with unprecedented speed. Where Japan saw a fleet, America saw a production schedule. The Essex-class carrier represented this shift more than any other ship. It was not designed as a one-off masterpiece. It was designed to be built again and again, faster each time. The blueprint itself was a weapon. Every improvement was folded into the next hull without stopping production. There was no pause to admire perfection, only momentum. Japanese intelligence reports began to note unusual activity in American shipyards, but the scale was difficult to believe. Even when reports mentioned multiple large carriers under construction at once, senior officers often dismissed them as exaggerations or propaganda. The idea that the United States could commission more fleet carriers during the war than Japan had built in its entire history seemed impossible. Meanwhile, American carrier pilots were already preparing for a future fleet that did not yet exist. Training programs expanded massively. Air crews were trained not just to replace losses, but to fill entire new air groups. This was another concept Japan underestimated. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, experienced pilots were considered elite and irreplaceable. In the U.S. Navy, experience was systematized, documented, and passed on at scale. As 1942 progressed, the balance of time itself began to favor America. Every month that passed without a decisive Japanese victory was a month in which American industrial output surged further ahead. Japan could still strike hard, but it could not strike fast enough to stop what was coming. By the end of the year, keels for Essex-class carriers were already laid in numbers that shocked even American planners. What Japan had achieved through years of careful planning and daring operations, America was preparing to surpass through sheer industrial velocity. The Pacific was about to be flooded, not with ships already at sea, but with ships that did not yet exist and soon would. By late 1942, the war at sea had exposed a brutal truth that Japanese planners could no longer ignore. While Japan had struck hard and fast at the beginning of the conflict, the United States was doing something far more dangerous in the background. It was building. Not replacing losses, not improvising repairs, but expanding on an industrial scale the world had never witnessed before. Every carrier sunk in the Pacific did not create panic in Washington. Instead, it triggered production schedules. Steel orders were increased. Shipyards expanded their shifts. New dry docks were poured while older ones worked around the clock. Japanese naval intelligence continued to report American ship losses, but what they struggled to understand was how quickly those losses were becoming irrelevant. The Essex-class aircraft carriers represented a fundamental shift in American thinking. These were not experimental ships. They were not limited-run designs. They were standardized war machines, engineered specifically for mass production. Hull sections were prefabricated inland and shipped by rail. Components were interchangeable. Crews could be trained on one Essex-class carrier and transferred to another without retraining on entirely new systems. Japanese observers were shocked by the speed. What had taken years to build before the war was now taking months. In some shipyards, an Essex-class carrier went from keel laying to launch faster than Japan could repair a single damaged fleet carrier. This imbalance was not just numerical. It was psychological. Japanese naval officers had been trained in a doctrine where quality, skill, and decisive battle mattered more than numbers. The belief was that elite pilots flying superior aircraft from carefully protected carriers could offset any material disadvantage. But that belief depended on one assumption, that America would tire, slow down, or negotiate. None of that happened. Instead, American carrier decks began to appear across the Pacific like moving factories. Each Essex-class carrier carried air wings larger than anything Japan could replace. Losses that would have crippled Japanese naval aviation were absorbed by American training pipelines that produced new pilots faster than they could be shot down. By 1943, Japanese pilots were no longer fighting the same war they had trained for. They were facing wave after wave of fresh aircraft, flown by crews who rotated home, rested, and returned. The Americans learned quickly, adapted tactics, and most importantly, survived long enough to improve. Every battle revealed the same pattern. Japanese pilots fought bravely, often with superior experience early on, but when they scored victories, more American carriers appeared. When Japan lost a carrier, it was gone forever. When America lost one, another was already fitting out, its aircraft elevators being tested, its radar systems calibrated, its deck crews training before the ship even joined the fleet. The ocean itself seemed to side with industrial momentum. American logistics ships followed the carriers, refueling and rearming them at sea. The Japanese Navy, once confident in decisive engagements, now found itself stretched thin, forced to defend supply lines it could barely maintain. By the end of this phase of the war, the realization began to spread quietly through Japanese command circles. They were not losing because of a single defeat. They were losing because they were fighting a nation whose factories were as lethal as its guns, whose shipyard were producing inevitability. And as the silhouettes of more Essex-class carriers appeared on the horizon, it became clear that this war would not be decided by courage alone, but by the ability to build faster than the enemy could destroy. By the end of 1942, the war at sea no longer looked the same. Japan had struck hard and early, sinking 4 American aircraft carriers in a single year. Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway had burned a brutal lesson into U.S. naval thinking. But while Japan believed it had crippled American naval power, something far more dangerous was already taking shape across the Pacific. Not at sea, but in steel mills, shipyards, and factories stretching from the East Coast to the West. American naval planners understood a simple truth. The carrier was now the center of modern warfare. Battleships no longer decided wars. Aircraft carriers did. And instead of trying to replace losses one by one, the United States made a decision that shocked even its own allies. It would flood the oceans with carriers faster than Japan could ever hope to destroy them. The Essex-class aircraft carrier was the physical expression of that decision. Larger, tougher, and more flexible than anything the U.S. Navy had operated before, the Essex was designed not just to fight, but to survive, adapt, and return to combat again and again. Every lesson learned from early defeats was built directly into its steel frame. Unlike earlier American carriers, the Essex had a wider flight deck, improved armor protection, and a much larger air group. It could carry nearly 100 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, all coordinated into a single floating airbase. This meant that one Essex-class carrier could project more air power than entire naval task forces had only a few years earlier. But the true power of the Essex program was not just in its design. It was in how fast America could build them. Shipyards that once took years to complete a major warship were now launching Essex carriers in months. Construction schedules overlapped. Keels were laid before previous hulls even touched water. Workers ran shifts around the clock. Welding replaced traditional riveting. Prefabricated sections arrived by rail and were dropped directly into place. Japan, watching from across the Pacific, struggled to understand what it was seeing. In 1942, sinking a single American carrier felt like a major victory. By 1944, those victories meant almost nothing. Every loss was replaced, sometimes twice over, before Japanese planners could even adjust their strategy. One by one, Essex-class carriers began arriving in the Pacific. They did not operate alone. They came in groups, protected by cruisers and destroyers, supported by oilers that kept them fueled at sea for months at a time. This allowed American task forces to strike again and again without retreating to distant ports. Japanese pilots soon realized something terrifying. Shooting down American planes no longer weakened the enemy. New squadrons simply appeared. New carriers took the place of damaged ones. The skies seemed endless. Each Essex carrier became a factory of destruction, launching strikes at dawn, recovering aircraft at dusk, repairing damage overnight, and doing it all again the next day. Where Japan counted fuel, planes, and trained pilots, America counted time, and time was on its side. By the time the war reached its later stages, Japan was no longer fighting individual carriers. It was fighting an entire industrial system floating on the sea, and the Essex-class was its sharpest edge. By late 1943, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted so dramatically that even Japanese intelligence officers struggled to explain what they were seeing. Less than 2 years earlier, Japan had stunned the world by sinking 4 American aircraft carriers in a single campaign year. Now, American carrier task forces were appearing faster than Japanese planners could count them. Each new U.S. carrier was not just a replacement for earlier losses. The Essex-class represented an entirely new scale of naval warfare. Larger decks, stronger armor, faster aircraft elevators, and vastly improved damage control systems meant these ships were designed to survive punishment that would have crippled earlier carriers. Japanese naval doctrine had been built around decisive battles and limited carrier numbers. The Essex-class shattered that logic. As the first Essex carriers entered combat in 1943 and early 1944, Japanese pilots noticed something deeply unsettling. Even after successful attacks, American carriers kept operating. Fires were contained. Flight decks were repaired within hours. Aircraft resumed launches the same day. This resilience shocked Japanese airmen who were accustomed to seeing a single well-placed bomb disable a carrier for weeks. What truly terrified Japanese commanders was not just the quality of the Essex-class, but their numbers. Ship after ship appeared in American task forces. Intelligence reports that once listed 2 or 3 carriers now counted 6, 8, sometimes more. Losses that would have crippled Japan barely slowed the United States. A damaged carrier withdrew, and another identical one took its place. By 1944, Japan faced an impossible equation. American industry had transformed carrier warfare into a production problem rather than a strategic gamble. While Japan carefully preserved its remaining carriers, America accepted losses as temporary setbacks. The United States did not fight to protect ships. It built ships to sustain the fight. Japanese pilots began encountering layered air defenses unlike anything they had faced before. Essex-class carriers operated with dense fighter screens, radar-directed interceptions, and coordinated anti-aircraft fire. Attacking American fleets became exponentially more dangerous. Even elite Japanese aviators found themselves overwhelmed by numbers, technology, and coordination. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese air power collapsed against the Essex carrier groups. Aircraft launched bravely, but few returned. The event became known among American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for Japan, it marked the end of carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. The carriers remained, but the trained pilots were gone. Behind the scenes, American shipyards continued their relentless pace. New Essex-class carriers were commissioned even as others were fighting. Crews trained aboard ships that had never seen combat, only to join fleets already dominating the Pacific. For Japan, there was no comparable reserve. Every loss was permanent. By the final year of the war, Japanese naval officers privately admitted what had become obvious. The war at sea had been lost not in a single battle, but in American factories. Japan had sunk 4 U.S. carriers in 1942, believing it had crippled its enemy. Instead, it had awakened an industrial response that produced 14 Essex-class carriers, each more capable than the last. The realization was devastating. Even perfect tactics could not overcome an enemy who replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted. The Pacific War had become a war of endurance, and Japan no longer had the means to endure it. As American carriers closed in on the Japanese home islands, the Essex-class symbolized something far greater than naval power. They represented a new reality of modern warfare, where industrial strength decided outcomes long before the first aircraft took off from the deck. By late 1943 and into 1944, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted so dramatically that even Japanese commanders could no longer deny the reality before them. What had once been a daring and confident carrier force was now reduced to a shadow, struggling to protect shrinking supply lines in an increasingly vulnerable homeland. The Essex-class carriers did not arrive as isolated warships. They came as a system. Each carrier sailed with escorts, logistics ships, fuel oilers, repair tenders, and replacement aircraft already scheduled before battles even began. When a carrier was damaged, it was withdrawn, repaired, and returned to combat while Japan was still arguing over how to replace a single lost deck. Japanese pilots began encountering a terrifying pattern. One carrier group would strike in the morning. Another would appear by afternoon. A third would arrive the following day. For Japan, losses were permanent. For America, losses were temporary setbacks recorded in paperwork and solved by production schedules. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 made the truth undeniable. Japanese air crews launched with courage, but they flew into an industrial storm. Radar-directed fighters, well-trained Hellcat pilots, and endless replacement aircraft turned the skies into a one-sided slaughter. Japanese veterans later called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a grim admission of how hopeless the imbalance had become. Behind every American carrier was a factory. Behind every lost aircraft was another already rolling off an assembly line. Behind every sunk escort was a shipyard launching 2 more. Japan had once measured success in daring strikes. America measured it in tonnage, timelines, and throughput. As the war moved closer to Japan itself, Essex-class carriers operated almost continuously. They struck airfields, factories, rail lines, ports, and shipyards. There was no pause for recovery on the Japanese side.